There are stories that quietly defy explanation. Stories that, on the surface, seem small, almost hidden away, and yet carry within them a mystery so profound that they leave even seasoned professionals speechless. The case of Brian Thomas Gallagher is one of those stories. A child who breathed for less than an hour, a child whose name could have been lost to time. And yet, nearly 4 decades later, his tiny body would resurface as a silent witness to something that faith calls grace and science admits it cannot easily explain. Brian's life began in 1982 on a U.S. military base in Fort Knox, Kentucky. His parents, Sean and Mary Pat Gallagher, were a faithful Catholic couple, young and full of hope as they awaited the birth of their son. But joy turned quickly to grief. Complications during delivery meant their baby would not live long. Brian was born, took a few fragile breaths, and within the span of less than an hour, he slipped from this world. For Sean and Mary Pat, the moment was heartbreaking, the kind of wound that leaves a mark on the soul forever. But even in those fleeting minutes, they turned to what they knew best, their faith. Knowing their child's life was fading, they urgently requested baptism from the Catholic chaplain on the base. There are no written records of the sacrament, and the parents themselves did not witness the rite. Yet what mattered most was their intention. They had asked, they had desired, and in Catholic belief, that desire itself holds great meaning. The Church teaches something called the baptism of desire, that when the heart truly longs for God's grace, He does not withhold it. In this light, Brian's brief life and uncertain baptism become more than a tragedy. They become a story of trust, of parents handing their child back into God's hands with the hope that His mercy would cover what human circumstances left incomplete. The Gallaghers, knowing that Fort Knox would not be their permanent home, chose to bury Brian in Highmore, South Dakota, near Sean's extended family. It was a quiet decision, a way of placing their child close to family roots, a way of saying, even in death, he is not far from those who love him. For decades, Brian rested there in silence, his name remembered by his parents, but unknown to the wider world. Life moved forward, as it always does, though the grief of losing a child never disappears completely. His parents carried him in their hearts, trusting that one day they would see him again. And then, in 2019, when they began planning for their own eventual burial at the Black Hills National Cemetery near Sturgis, they decided to have Brian's body reinterred there too, so that when their time came, they could rest beside him. It was a simple plan born out of love to unite their family in death, as they had longed to in life. But what happened during that reinterment would change everything. A routine exhumation, a process meant to transfer a small coffin from one place to another, became the stage for an astonishing discovery. When the original casket was accidentally pierced and opened, the funeral director braced himself for what he expected to find the natural outcome of nearly 40 years underground. Instead, he was met with a sight so unusual, so beyond reason, that it would spark wonder, astonishment, and, for many, deep faith. This is where Brian's story moves from heartbreaking loss into mystery. A child who barely lived, a child buried in obscurity, suddenly stood before the world again, not through words, not through achievements, but simply through his preserved body, untouched by time, as if silently whispering, "Life and love do not end in the grave." It was meant to be a quiet, almost administrative moment. A body moved from one cemetery to another, a small gesture of love from parents who wanted their son close to them in death. The Gallaghers had no expectation of anything extraordinary. For them, the reinterment of their child was about family, about resting together in one place when their earthly lives had run their course. In 2019, 37 years after that short, painful hour when Brian lived and died, the process began. Workers arrived at the cemetery in Highmore, South Dakota, tasked with exhuming the small casket. and preparing it for transfer to the Black Hills National Cemetery near Sturgis. To them, it was routine. To Sean and Mary Pat, it was tender. Their son, whom they had not seen in decades, would finally be moved to the place where they too would one day be buried. But then came the accident. As the machinery dug carefully into the earth, a backhoe tine pierced the small wooden casket. What should have been a smooth removal suddenly required the funeral director to open the casket and assess the damage. It was here, in this unplanned, unscripted moment, that a miracle seemed to unfold. When the casket was opened, what the funeral director saw defied every expectation. Instead of the skeletal remains that should have been left after 37 years underground, he found a body that appeared entirely intact. Tiny features were still visible. The skin was soft and supple to the touch. The face was lifelike, with no sign of discoloration or decay. There was no odor, no mold, no mildew, no wrinkling or disfigurement. Even the infant's hair remained in place. It was as though time itself had stood still. The funeral director, trained and experienced in the realities of death, could hardly believe his eyes. In his own words, his body was still flexible for an embalmed infant enough that we were easily able to remove his clothes to wash them. That detail alone is staggering. After nearly 4 decades, Brian's body was not stiff, not fragile, but still pliable enough to be handled gently. His blanket and gown, which had lain in the earth with him all those years, were removed and washed. His small body was cleaned, redressed, and placed into a new casket. Such things are unthinkable in normal exhumations, where even the most carefully embalmed remains have long since deteriorated to bone. Science does have an explanation for certain cases of temporary preservation. Embalming can slow decomposition, especially if combined with particular soil conditions. But the funeral directors involved in Brian's case were unanimous. This went far beyond anything embalming could achieve. Over decades, embalmed bodies still shrink, discolor, stiffen, and eventually return to dust. What they saw here simply could not be explained by natural means. For the Gallaghers, the news was overwhelming. Their son, who had lived so briefly and been hidden away for so long, was suddenly before them again, whole, untouched by decay. It was as if God himself had kept watch over the tiny body, preserving it not for spectacle, but for a deeper message. A message that life, even one measured in minutes, has eternal meaning. Word of the discovery began to spread, and with it came astonishment. Funeral directors confirmed the rarity of what had been found. Parents who had lost children read the story and wept with a mixture of grief and hope. To them, Brian was no longer just the child of Sean and Mary Pat. He was a symbol, a reminder that even the smallest life is precious, even the shortest existence is not forgotten by heaven. What had begun as a private act of love became something much larger, a story that would call countless people to reflect, to pray, and to wonder what God might be revealing through the incorrupt body of a child who never had the chance to grow up. The discovery of Brian's incorrupt body quickly raised a question that lingers whenever the inexplicable breaks into ordinary life. How can this be? For those present at the exhumation, the sight of a baby preserved in lifelike condition, nearly 40 years after burial, was beyond anything they had ever witnessed. The funeral director's words were careful yet unmistakable. This was not something that science could easily account for. To understand why, it helps to look at what normally happens to the human body after death. Even when embalming is performed, a process that replaces bodily fluids with chemicals to slow decay, the preservation is temporary. Within months, discoloration sets in. Over years, the body dehydrates, shrinks, and stiffens. After decades, even the best embalmed remains collapse into dust and bone. This is why exhumations almost always reveal skeletal remains, sometimes accompanied by fragments of clothing or rosaries. but never intact flesh, supple skin, or lifelike features. And yet, that is exactly what was found in Brian's case. His skin was soft, his features perfectly recognizable, his tiny frame undisturbed by the passage of time. Those who know the science of death and burial have been candid. This falls far outside the normal limits of embalming and soil preservation. It is not something that can be written off as chance. Of course, science is cautious, and rightly so. Not every mystery is supernatural, and not every unusual case is a miracle. But for the faithful, Brian's incorrupt body echoes other stories from the long history of the church, stories of men and women who died centuries ago, yet whose bodies remained untouched by decay. Throughout Catholic tradition, incorruptibility has often been seen as a sign of holiness. The most famous case is Saint Bernadette of Lourdes, who died in 1879. When her body was exhumed decades later, those present were stunned to find her face and hands preserved in remarkable condition, almost as though she were asleep. Her incorrupt body is still venerated in France today. Similarly, saints like Saint Teresa of Avila and Saint John Vianney have shown inexplicable preservation, leaving behind a testimony not of scientific achievement, but of God's mysterious favor. The Church, however, is careful. It does not declare incorruptibility alone as proof of sainthood. Bodies can sometimes be preserved through natural processes, soil chemistry, lack of oxygen, or unusual burial conditions. And yet, when cases defy all reasonable natural explanations, the Church does take notice. They are seen not as guarantees of holiness, but as signs that point beyond themselves, whispers of God's presence in the physical world. In Brian's case, the incorrupt body of an infant who never even lived long enough to grow or to speak adds another layer of wonder. If incorruptibility has been a sign of sanctity in the lives of canonized saints, what could it mean in the body of a child who lived for less than an hour? For many, the answer lies in God's special love for children. Christ himself said, "Let the little children come to me, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven." Perhaps, in Brian's incorrupt body, that verse takes on a startlingly literal form, a child preserved as a reminder of the purity, innocence, and eternal value of every young life. This is where science meets mystery. Funeral directors testify that what they saw should not be possible. Parents and faithful believers see in it a sign of God's grace. And in the space between those two perspectives, all lingers. It is not a proof to silence doubt, nor is it a spectacle to be exploited. It is a mystery, an invitation to look deeper, to ask what message God might be speaking through the incorrupt body of a baby who lived only a single hour. For Sean and Mary Pat Gallagher, Brian's story was never about headlines or public recognition. It was about their child, the son they held for less than an hour, the son they buried in a small cemetery in South Dakota, the son they carried in their hearts for nearly 4 decades. And yet, when his incorrupt body was discovered, the meaning of Brian's life seemed to ripple far beyond their family. His silent witness began to speak to others, to parents grieving their own children, to families wrestling with loss, and to all who wonder whether the smallest lives carry eternal significance. In the Catholic tradition, children hold a special place in the heart of God. Jesus himself made this clear when he gathered little ones around him and told his disciples, "Unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." The innocence, trust, and humility of a child become not just admirable qualities, but the very key to eternal life. In Brian's incorrupt body, many see the teaching made visible. A child who had no words to speak, no deeds to perform, no life to build on earth, nonetheless became a herald of God's truth. That life is valuable not because of what we accomplish, but because of who we are in the eyes of God. For parents who have lost children, whether through miscarriage, stillbirth, illness, or sudden tragedy, Brian's story carries a particular power. The sight of a body preserved in such purity offers reassurance that their children, too, are not forgotten. It reminds them that God's love extends beyond the grave, that He treasures every life, no matter how brief. Brian stands as a silent companion to their grief, a sign that even in loss there can be hope, and even in sorrow there can be a glimpse of heaven's promise. The Church has long recognized that incorruptibility, while never proof of sainthood, can serve as a sign of divine favor. In Brian's case, the message seems deeply pastoral, a reminder to receive children as gifts, to protect them, to honor their short lives, and to trust in their intercession before God. Theologians speak of the innocents, the children who die young, who never had the chance to sin, who rest securely in the arms of their Creator. Brian, in his incorrupt state, seems to embody that innocence, pointing not to his own holiness, but to the holiness of God who creates and sustains all life. His story also challenges adults. The great Saint Augustine often preached on the need for Christians to become childlike in their faith, not childish in immaturity, but childlike in trust, simplicity, and dependence on God. Centuries later, Saint Thérèse of Lisieux echoed the same truth in her little way, the path of approaching God with the heart of a child. In Brian's incorrupt body, these teachings find a kind of physical symbol. His preserved form invites adults to strip away the pride, fear, and self-reliance that so often cloud faith, and to return to God with the same openness that a child brings. But perhaps the most striking part of Brian's story is its quietness. This is not the tale of a saint who preached to thousands or performed great works. This is not the story of a visionary or a martyr. This is the story of a baby who lived for less than an hour, buried without fanfare, hidden from the world for decades. And yet, in the end, his body became a testimony that traveled across the globe, reaching countless people. It is as if God chose the smallest and weakest among us to reveal something profound, that no life is wasted, and that even in silence, His glory can shine. Brian's incorrupt body did not appear in isolation. His story, astonishing as it is, fits into a larger tapestry of mysterious cases that the Catholic Church has encountered for centuries, cases where bodies remain preserved long after nature should have erased every trace. These incorrupt remains have fascinated believers and confounded scientists, often standing as tangible reminders that God sometimes chooses to leave a sign of His presence in the very flesh of His children. One of the most famous examples is Saint Bernadette Soubirous, the visionary of Lourdes. She died in 1879 at the age of 35, having spent her short life in humility and prayer. When her body was exhumed decades later, witnesses were stunned. Her face, her hands, her form all remained intact. Today, more than a century later, her body can still be seen in the convent at Nevers, France, a quiet testimony to the girl who once saw the Virgin Mary at a grotto. For pilgrims, the incorrupt body of Bernadette is not merely an object of fascination, but a call to deeper faith, proof that holiness leaves a mark even on the mortal body. Another striking case is Saint Teresa of Avila, the great Spanish mystic of the 16th century. Centuries after her death, her body was found preserved, with reports of a sweet fragrance emanating from it, something that has often accompanied incorrupt saints. Similarly, Saint John Vianney, the humble parish priest of Ars in France, has drawn pilgrims for generations because his body too remains remarkably intact. And incorruptibility is not just a relic of the distant past. In 2019, the world learned of Sister Mary Wilhelmina Lancaster, a Benedictine nun in Missouri. When her body was exhumed 4 years after her death, it showed almost no signs of decomposition, despite not being embalmed and being buried in a simple wooden coffin. Thousands of pilgrims flocked to see her, touched by the idea that even in our modern age, God continues to leave signs that point beyond the natural order. Placed alongside these cases, Brian's incorrupt body raises profound questions. Saints like Bernadette, Teresa, and John Vianney lived lives of visible holiness and sacrifice, leaving behind legacies of prayer and miracles. Sister Mary Wilhelmina gave decades of service as a religious sister, shaping generations through her example. But Brian was different. He had no time to live a holy life, no chance to preach, no opportunity to choose virtue or sacrifice. And yet, his body joins this mysterious company of incorrupt witnesses. What does it mean that God preserved the body of a child who lived less than an hour? For many, the answer is found in the radical message of the gospel. God's love is not earned. It is given. Holiness is not a reward for accomplishments, but a gift of grace. If incorruptibility is a sign of God's favor, then Brian's incorrupt body reminds us that even the smallest life, even a life that the world might overlook, is precious in his eyes. In this way, Brian's story bridges the past and the present. His incorrupt remains stand in continuity with centuries of saints whose preserved bodies inspire awe. But they also speak freshly to today's world, a world often tempted to measure value by productivity, success, or achievement. Here, in the body of a child who never even had the chance to speak, is a countercultural message. Life itself is sacred, and every human being carries eternal worth. In the end, the story of Brian Thomas Gallagher is not just about an incorrupt body discovered decades after burial. It is about love, faith, loss, and the quiet ways in which God sometimes breaks into ordinary life with extraordinary signs. Brian lived for less than an hour. To the world, that might seem like nothing, a life too short to matter, a flicker extinguished before it could burn. And yet, in God's eyes, even a single breath carries infinite worth. Even the shortest life is eternal, because every life begins and ends in Him. When the funeral director opened that small casket in 2019, he did not simply discover a preserved child. He discovered a testimony that life is not measured in years, but in love. A testimony that even in silence, God can speak. And a testimony that death, which so often feels final, does not have the last word. For parents who have buried children, Brian's incorrupt body has become a symbol of comfort. It whispers to grieving hearts that their children too are safe, that their lives were not wasted, that their innocence is now their glory. For families who struggle with loss, his story becomes a quiet companion in their sorrow, a reminder that heaven remembers what earth forgets. For the wider church, Brian's incorrupt body invites reflection. The church does not proclaim sainthood on the basis of incorruptibility alone, but she does recognize in such signs a call to deeper faith. Brian cannot be canonized. He left behind no writings, no miracles, no works of virtue. And yet, perhaps his miracle is precisely this: that a baby with no earthly achievements has become a preacher of God's love without ever saying a word. His silent witness echoes the words of Jesus. "Let the little children come to me, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven." In Brian, that verse takes flesh. His incorrupt body reminds us that the kingdom of God is not earned by the strong or the accomplished, but given freely to the pure and the childlike. His very existence becomes a homily on the gospel, a sermon written not in ink, but in flesh preserved by mystery. And beyond theology, there is something profoundly human in this story. In a world that often measures people by what they can produce, Brian's incorrupt body says, "You are valuable simply because you exist." In a society that sometimes overlooks the weak, the voiceless, the unborn, Brian's incorrupt body says, "No life is too small for God to cherish." In a culture quick to forget, Brian's incorrupt body says, "Nothing is forgotten in heaven." Perhaps that is why his story resonates so deeply. It is not just about one family in South Dakota. It is about all of us. It is about our longing for permanence in a world of decay. It is about our hope that love is stronger than death. It is about our desire to believe that even when graves are opened, what we find is not emptiness, but signs of a life that continues. The Gallaghers never sought attention. They never imagined their son's name would spread beyond their family. But through God's mysterious providence, Brian now speaks to thousands, even millions, as a silent herald of hope. His incorrupt body is not a spectacle to be gawked at, but a gift to be pondered. A reminder that grace often hides itself in small, quiet places, in a manger, on a cross, in the body of a child laid to rest. As this story closes, one truth remains. Brian's life, though brief, was not meaningless. It was a seed planted in the soil of grief, later revealed as a sign of love that does not die. His incorrupt body points us beyond science, beyond sorrow, beyond the grave, to a God who holds every child, every tear, every fleeting life in His eternal hands. And perhaps that is the final message, that no matter how small, no matter how short, no matter how hidden, every life is a story God Himself writes, and in His hands, no story is ever lost.